Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined today by Jacob Gibbs. We've got a great show for you, Jacob. Welcome back.
Hey, Heath. Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure. I saw that you were in Harrisonville, where we both grew up. Crazy enough, I think most of your listeners know that at this point. But that's exciting. We missed each other this time, but you got the plate full of nachos, the helmet full of nachos at the K. I was at the Royals game the very next day, so it was a good weekend. Good time to be a Royals baseball fan. And just a month from now, we're going to be able to hang out in Kansas City. So I'm just so excited, man.
So I do want to talk about the nachos because I got more of a negative response than I was expecting. I need to explain to people, like, this was almost a full size, I would say. I could fit it on my head. Helmet with nacho chips. And then on top of that was pulled pork and baked beans and coleslaw and pickles and cheesy corn. And it was delicious, a complete meal, and it was only $16. The nachos with cheese and no helmet, $8. Like, it was just an incredible deal, and it tasted delicious, and I had no regrets.
Yeah, man, I paid $27 for a margarita and a baseball bat at the K, so I think 16 is a steal, honestly.
I mean, a margarita in a baseball bat sounds pretty fantastic.
Can't beat it.
Before we go any further, why don't you tell everybody what you've been working on for Sportsline? What's coming up?
So I'm really getting in the weeds over at Sportsline, looking at the per route data and breaking that down with all the different use cases for that information. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. Looking at per route data against different coverage types and, some of the ramifications of those results. And then also just kind of looking at some on and off splits and all that kind of stuff as well. So just kind of contextualizing what we have, what we saw from last year's receivers, what we have for the incoming rookie receivers, and trying to help people understand better how to use this information, because I saw you had Ryan Heath on. That was an awesome episode. Love the work that he does. He's been really pushing first downs per route run. There's all this per route data that people have heard about, and it's easy to get a bit lost in it. And so just trying to help people understand better what it all means, how to use it, and what we, how we should be thinking about players heading into 2024, given this information.
We are, I appreciate Joe. Joe knows how to get his comment up on the screen. Heath and Jacob, the Dynasty Dream Team. It's a great name. That's what we should call the podcast, Dynasty Dream Team. We are going to get in the weeds. I don't like to say we're going to get lost in the weeds, because we're going to like find we're going to get found in the weeds. We're going to find all kinds of good information. We'll talk about some ambiguous wide receiver and tight end rooms: the Packers, the Texans, the Chiefs, the Chargers. We'll talk about some of those on-off splits. But first, I want to have just a short discussion about advanced stats, because I know that, like, a lot of these terms that we use are getting more popular and people mostly understand them, but we still got a long ways to go before everybody understands what we're talking about when we get into yards per route run, targets per route run, all on-off splits, all that stuff. So let's just start with 3 questions for Gibbs. And I want you to talk about targets per route run and how it relates to target rate, because the understanding around target rate is pretty easy. Like, the number of targets I get is a percentage of the number of passes that are thrown. Super simple, pretty easy to work into projections as well. How does targets per route run, which we're going to talk about a lot on this show, kind of relate to that?
I think so. The first place to start with per route data, the primary value of per route data to me is when it comes to injuries or any circumstances that cause a player to not be able to fill a full-time role. So maybe that's just Rashee Rice last year, and this happens a lot with rookies, where they're kind of eased into their role, but the per route data suggests that they're capable of putting up huge numbers if they were able to get a full-time role. And then, again, with injuries, last year we've got 2 just like prime use cases of players who went a bit overlooked because their baseline stats weren't overly impressive, because their route run totals were suppressed by injuries. And so one of them is Puka Nacua. We talk about him all the time, but his career at BYU really was sort of underwhelming as a whole, but that had to do with a lot of circumstances that were outside of his control. But his per route data suggested there was really exciting upside if you were able to get a bigger role. And then obviously he fit perfectly in McVay's system there. Nico Collins is the other one, another huge breakout last year, where his per route data in his first couple of seasons was really pretty strong, at least strong enough in a bad situation that I thought it was premature to be giving up on him the way that a lot of people were. And then we see when he comes into a mostly healthy season in a better situation, he just goes nuts. And so that's the main use for per route data, and how it can really provide value relative to target share, because target share only captures a part of the whole, whereas per route data really does, granularize it and make it more accessible, I think, to like get an understanding of what a player could do. So that's really important. And then the other thing to understand is that formation and personnel really affect all this per route data. And that is also not necessarily reflected in a player's target share. So a good example is Jayden Reed. Anybody who is playing a part-time role because their team uses two receiver sets a lot, and so that player comes off of the field in two receiver sets, their per route data might look really strong and might suggest that, like, if they were put into a larger role, they could be really, really productive. And so it's just important to understand how it all works together. Another way that like personnel affects it is that when there's fewer wide receivers on the field, naturally per route data is going to look better because you're competing with fewer wide receivers for targets. Just generally speaking, wide receivers draw targets at a higher rate than tight ends and running backs. And so there's one wide receiver on the field, your yard per route run rate is going to be higher than if there's two wide receivers on the field, or if there's 3 or 4 wide receivers on the field. And some offenses are run completely different. The Miami Dolphins only had 3 or more receivers on the field 39% of the time last year. The league average is 62%. The Rams were up at like 75%. And so just understanding all of that and how it all works together really helps paint a bigger picture and like allows us to use this information better than just kind of like looking at it and comparing. Sometimes you really are comparing apples and oranges.
And we are going to get much deeper into the Packers situation. We see a comment in the chat: Reed and Wicks, 2 wide receiver ones. We did Dontayvion Wicks week is over. We did that like a week and a half ago. You're a little bit late for Dante, but I will say I'm not sure that we're going to agree with that assessment, but we will break down Wicks and Watson and Reed and Doubs and see, what Jacob says, the data says about them. What type of sample size do we need? Because you talked about for injury situations, and a lot of times we're looking at when this guy's off the field, this guy has done this. But if it's 10, 15 routes, I know we don't care. I would assume if it's 300 routes, we do. Where's the cutoff? Where should we start carrying, and where does it become pretty close to fixed?
So you can start to at least, I think, form hypotheses when you have like a few games worth of data. So like 10 or 15 is not enough. But generally speaking, most offenses, a wide receiver is going to run 30-ish routes per game. And so maybe if you're getting around the 100 route mark, you can start to form informed guesses at least. And for some use cases, you have to. We're not going to get a larger sample size. So for example, like when a wide receiver performs well on a per route basis against man coverage earlier in their career, that's a really, really exciting signal. If you look back at some of the best performers versus man coverage early in their career, they've all gone on to be studs. But unfortunately, with the way that NFL defenses are using more and more zone coverage, we like truly might only get 100 or so routes, like roughly 3 games worth of routes for like the incoming rookies against man coverage. And so like that's the bare minimum. Anything below that is really, so like, for example, I looked at Dalton Kincaid's splits on the routes that he ran with Stefon Diggs off the field, and they were nuts. They were really exciting, but it was like 46 routes. And so you can extrapolate that over a full season if you want, but like, honestly, it's not in any way predictive. For me, 350 routes is the number that is tested well when it comes to normalizing target per route run data. And target per route run data does become sticky and predictive a little bit more quickly than yards per route run. Ryan Heath did a great job talking about this. Yards per route run can be influenced so heavily by big plays. Just one 80-yard touchdown catch where a defender falls down, is going to balloon the yard per route run rate. And that's where targets and first downs per route can come in handy, because that's only going to be registered as one target and one first down, So yeah, I really don't believe in a player's yard per route run rate until they've actually shown it on like a year over year basis. But 350 is a good starting point. And that's most players are going to get that even in run first offenses. Most players are going to get that in one season.
Okay, so I'm changing your third question. We're going on the fly. Matt is a great. He's always in the chat, always participating, always getting at me on Twitter, helping us out. We really appreciate him. And so he used the trade calculator, sent Derek Carr in Superflex for Chase Brown, getting ripped on X for doing it. I am the most anti-Derek Carr person you've ever met, Jacob. And so I'm not mad at this at all. And he has 3 other quarterbacks. I think there's a decent chance that Derek Carr's dynasty trade value is 0 in like 6 months. Derek Carr for Chase Brown, how much do you hate it?
I don't love it. I'm not a fan of Chase Brown personally. I'm a little bit worried that this is like the only time he's going to have value is like this hypothetical version of what he could be. If you look at his big plays last year, most of them, he didn't really have to do anything. He's fast, so he can run in a straight line and beat nobody down the field and score a touchdown. I don't want to hit on Chase Brown, but there's opportunity there. So I guess from an upside standpoint, it makes sense if you don't need Carr. But to me, I'm just trying to maximize my assets. And in Superflex, you're going to probably be able to find someone who is going to be desperate at quarterback and will give you more than that for Carr, I think.
Yeah, and that could be like one of the problems with my approach to trade calculators is I'm more giving you my opinion of what people are worth. There are places out there that are also giving you the general consensus of like trades that are being made. And you may kind of need to combine those two things because I do think that I don't know. I don't like for the most part, I view a bad super flex quarterback that we think is going to start all year as like 112 is the starting point for discussions. And I think that's what Carr is. But for me, I wouldn't give up 112 for Derek Carr.
Yeah.
He's going to score 15 or 16 fantasy points a game, and I'm going to have to keep starting him. So I think you did okay, Matt. Everybody else thinks you did terrible. We will laugh at them later. Let's take our first break, and we will get into some ambiguous wide receiver rooms.
There's some new players in town, and they brought the plague.
You got my attention. You don't want that. Welcome to Kingstown.
Mayor of Kingstown. New season now streaming exclusively on Paramount Plus.
So as you can see, I am not in my normal location. I have received a lot of tweets saying, Heath, what did you think of episode 1 of season 3 of Mayor of Kingstown? And I've not seen it yet because I'm not in my home and I've not been in a place where I can watch it. I think I'm going to get back on Saturday. I may just watch episode 1 and episode 2 like back to back. I cannot wait. Please, no spoilers in the chat. Let's talk about the Packers wide receivers. And I want to start kind of just for the framework of how I view these guys, which will maybe have some people either leave immediately because they're mad at me about Dontayvion Wicks or start screaming in the chat. And then kind of what the data says about those guys, Jacob, and how that relates to whether I'm too high or too low on some of these guys. I have Jayden Reed at wide receiver 32, Christian Watson at wide receiver 36. Zero confidence between those two and which one should be higher. If you promised me that they were both going to have good health the rest of their careers, I would take Watson, but I'm not sure I'm buying completely into him fixing it by fixing the distribution of his hamstrings. Romeo Doubs at wide receiver 64, Dontayvion Wicks at wide receiver 73. Should there be that big a gap between the top two and the next two?
I think that there is that big of a gap between Doubs and the top two. I'm higher on Wicks than you.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm quite there with all the hype that's been blown lately on social media, but I do think Wicks is a really intriguing player. I think you and I are on the same page on Watson, and that's that we're significantly above consensus. I've been very surprised to see where he's drafted. My brother and I just this past week decided to start up. We did 7 Superflex drafts together,
Nice.
startup drafts, and so that's been super fun. And we're landing Watson more than almost any player, which is of course.
Are you doing FFPC or where are you doing those?
We're drafting on Sleeper.
Okay, okay, it's fun.
And so that's a risk. That's a thrill. We'll see how that turns out. I love Jayden Reed as a player. I worry that this might be the peak of his perceived value, at least in like the immediate short term here. I don't know what his role is going to be because I think Wicks is really good and they want to get him on the field. And I think Doubs and Watson are going to be the 2 receiver set guys. And they don't use 3 receivers a ton. And so like we saw Reed's role shrink when everybody was healthy. And so I do struggle a bit to buy him as like the top guy here, even though I think he's probably the most talented player. We'll get into his on-off splits with Christian Watson on and off the field later, but spoiler alert, they're really, really good when Watson's off the field. He looks like a true difference maker, which I don't know if we're getting that from any of these other guys. I think as a whole, this entire group is talented and works together cohesively, and the Packers offense is going to be really good. But to me, Reed and Watson are the 2 that like bring true upside.
So we're on the same page basically on Watson high. Or do you have Reed as the top 40 wide receiver, or are you considerably lower on him?
I think top 40 is about right for Dynasty.
Okay.
Yeah. Because if Watson gets hurt or anything, like it could just be like what we saw last year, but even better. And then his value is only going to go up.
Let's talk a little bit. I mean, we're going to do on-off splits after our next break for some of these teams we're not talking about, but for the Packers specifically, why don't you go ahead and break down the information you found on what these guys look like in terms of on-off splits?
Okay, yeah. So with Christian Watson off of the field last year, Jayden Reed had a 29% target per route run rate and a 2.55 yard per route run rate. For reference, like that is basically identical to CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown last year, and it came on a decent sample size. It doesn't hit that 350 route qualifier that I want. I don't think that we can necessarily expect this to be this high going forward, but like it's not just big plays inflating the yards per route run. Ryan Heath did bring up the fact that Reed's first downs per route run maybe suggests that his yard per route run rate is inflated a bit by big plays. 29% target per route run rate, though, is like super, super solid. That is not a fluke. And that, to me, is really exciting. They really like to design things for him, especially when Watson is off the field. He's more of the first read kind of guy a lot more, whereas Wicks and Doubs are kind of doing the dirty work on the outside. And so, to me, like, this isn't necessarily what we can expect from him as a player, but it shows that there's a ceiling here that is unique to him, I think. And really all it takes is Watson to continue to struggle with injuries in the way that we've seen, which is not something I'm rooting for by any means, but is definitely a realistic possibility. But with Watson on the field, this is 174 route sample size during Reed's rookie season, 18% target per route run rate, 1.45 yards per route run. That's kind of like Josh Downs, Curtis Samuel, Jackson Smith, and Jigba territory. I think he's the most electric player of that group, has the most juice in terms of like creating with the ball in his hands and, really getting open in the intermediate area. But that just goes to show that, like, I think if Watson's on the field, I'm pretty worried about Reed's projection for this year. He's somebody that, like, for just season-long leagues, I'm going to have almost none of. The top end of the range of outcomes is high enough that I think you have to get some exposure if you play multiple dynasty leagues. But he was really impacted by Watson. And really, when Watson was on the field, he got a ton of volume last year. And I think it's entirely possible that with a full off season of health and working together with Jordan Love, we could see that come to more efficient production than it did last year. We saw him really put together in 2 games before he got hurt in the middle of the season. You remember him dominating the Chiefs. So the Lions, like, he really looked like the guy we saw during his rookie season. So I just want to bring up that in 159 routes, when Watson, Doubs, and Reed were all on the field, Watson led the team in targets and receiving yards, and it really wasn't very close. 335 receiving yards for him, 200 for Reed, 158 for Doubs, 547 air yards for Watson. The next closest was Reed at 278. I just think he's a great fit with Love. Love really is willing to air it out and make anticipation throws down the field that very few quarterbacks are capable making. And so if we're just talking about like upside for this year, it's Watson to me all day. It's not even close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So you say it's not even close. It's not even close if Watson stays healthy.
Yeah.
But Reed's upside if Watson goes down week 1 is also very, very high.
For sure.
Okay. So we kind of talked a lot about Reed if maybe being in trouble if Watson stays healthy. Another comment from the chat, and I think this was right. Doubs may outproduce Wicks if Watson figures out his health. It seems to me, and I know why nobody wants, especially in best ball season, nobody wants to draft Romeo Doubs, but he's probably going to play the most. Right? It doesn't matter if Christian Watts is healthy or not healthy. He's going to be out there. And so Reed and Wicks are really the guys who are going to have to figure out their place. And Wicks is probably a wide receiver 4 on this team if there's no injury.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the case. That's how I'm projecting it as well. Romeo Doubs, I went back and watched a ton of Packers. I watched like 6 or 7 games just because I was so curious about Jordan Love. Doubs shows up all the time, making big plays towards the perimeter in the end zone. Like he is absolutely the wide receiver 1, the X receiver that they trust. It's not a role that translates to fantasy production all that often just because it's hard to draw targets consistently in that role. But he's going to be on the field and he's going to be in the way of Wicks.
But I play in like a 14-team dynasty league where you start 3 wide receivers and 2 flexes, not super flexes. Mm-hmm. Those types of leagues, I think Romeo Doubs is probably a little bit underrated because if you just need guys to score fantasy points, he's going to play every week and he's probably going to give you something pretty much every week.
Yeah, no, I think
it just has to be a deeper league for him to matter probably in terms of a starting role.
I think that's fair. And there might be upside. If you remember the playoffs last year, he like really balled out for them. He had 240 yards in 2 games. I don't know. I just think that's interesting. I think he's a pretty decent player, like more than I think because of the per route data and all of the emphasis that we have created around like fantasy stats. Somebody like Doubs gets a little bit underrated when he's actually a pretty solid player.
Is it fair to say like when we had DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams together that Romeo Doubs is Jamal Williams and Christian Watson's DeAndre Swift?
Something like that.
Something like that. Like Watson's the guy that we're all going to like more, and Doubs is the guy that the coaches are going to really want to have on the field all the time. Yeah, he's a very good football player. I want to talk for just a second about the tight ends because I think I'm probably lower on both of these guys than everyone else because I truly don't know who's better. I think Luke Musgrave is the starter, and that he functioned and he's going to see the most targets, especially downfield when they're both on the field. But I do think Tucker Kraft showed enough that he's going to impact Musgrave in a way that maybe neither one of them get enough targets to matter. I don't have Musgrave or Kraft as a top 20 tight end. Do you feel confident in either one of these guys?
No, we see it the same way. I think they're completely different players. And
right.
Musgrave is the guy who has the fantasy skill set. I think he played a lot better as the season went on. Injuries ended up being a problem for him and keeping him from playing a big role in the playoffs. But he cleaned up some of the stuff that we saw early in the season where he was struggling and just looked young. I think he has the potential to develop into something for dynasty leagues. He's a great stash. To me, Kraft is not really ever someone I'm that interested in dynasty. I think he kind of gets put in the same range as Musgrave when really I don't see them that way at all. I think he's a great blocker and is going to be a big piece of what the Packers do in real life. And because of that, he is going to kind of get in the way for Musgrave when it comes to Musgrave's, route participation and things like that.
Yeah, I think what people see is, well, what if Luke Musgrave gets hurt again? Tucker Kraft looked like he could be a tight end that matters. It looks like they want to have a tight end that matters in this offense. I don't know how with playing 7 wide receivers and 3 tight ends. They all get 40% of the snaps or something, but
yeah, if Musgrave's hurt, and then I think he could maybe get there with touchdowns. But yeah. I think it's going to be really hard for him to get targets in this offense.
I want to switch to another team. It might be hard to get targets in their offense, and that is the Houston Texans, because everybody knows on this show how much I love Tank Dell. He's my wide receiver 16 in Dynasty, which is, I think, a little bit heavy compared to consensus. Nico Collins is everyone else's favorite. He's wide receiver 21 for me in Dynasty. So they've got 2 top 24 wide receivers. And oh yeah, they just went and added Stefon Diggs, who, except for like half a season last year, has been so much better than either one of these guys. He's my wide receiver 47 in Dynasty because he's approaching 30 years old and on a 1-year contract. And I'm really not sure, with the rapport that Tank Dell and Nico already have with CJ Stroud, how Diggs is going to come in and function as a wide receiver 1. And it seems like both those guys are going to be a lot more efficient with the targets they receive.
Yeah, I see it the same way. I have almost no Stefon Diggs in drafts this summer. I think it would probably take an injury to Tank Dell for him to make me regret that. Just given age curves of wide receiver and what we've seen in terms of his per route rates falling off. I think he's going to probably fill a slot role for the Texans, and there's just not going to be a ton of air yards or upside in that role, is my guess. Nico is the guy I want to talk about. Tank Dell is awesome. Yeah. I can't quite get there with your ranking on Tank, but I love it. I love him as a player so much that I appreciate the optimism and think that it's possible that you're right. I mean, anytime CJ Stroud has an opportunity, he mentions Tank Dell this offseason. He loves him, and rightfully so. Nico's the guy I want to talk about because I think people maybe have some preconceived notions about who Nico Collins might be because of his production in Michigan, his draft capital being a bit underwhelming, and then his first couple of years also being a bit underwhelming. I want to do this through the lens of the personnel and the way that it affects yards per out run, like we talked about at the top of the show. So with one receiver on the field, this is the wide receiver positional average of the past 3 years. With one wide receiver on the field, 2.26 yards per out run is the average. With two receivers on the field, it drops to 1.93. With three or more receivers on the field, it drops all the way to 1.39. So that's a huge drop from 1 to 2 to 3. This is important for players like Nico Collins, Tyreek Hill, Brandon Ayuk, basically anyone in these Kyle Shanahan coaching tree offenses. We see pretty inflated per route data. And so both Brandon Ayuk and Nico Collins averaged over 3 yards per route run last year, which puts them in just insane company. Over the past 10 years, the only other receivers to run 300 or more routes and average 3 or more yards per route run are Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones, and Cooper Kupp. Brandon Ayuk and Nico Collins joined that group this year. So Brandon Ayuk, I went and filtered out any plays where there were 2 or fewer receivers on the field, and it really, really influenced Brandon Ayuk. His yard per route run rate with 2 or fewer receivers on the field was 4.1. That dropped all the way to 2 with 3 or more receivers on the field, which is still good, 16th overall out of 105 receivers. Nico Collins did not see his rate drop hardly at all. With 3 or more receivers on the field, Nico Collins averaged 2.9 yards per route run. And so I went and compared that to receivers over the past 5 seasons. It's truly like all elite top 5 fantasy wide receivers. It's Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill again, and then Nico Collins in 2023, above Michael Thomas's 2019 season, above Devontae Adams in 2021, above CeeDee Lamb last year, above Jamar Chase's 2021 season, above anything that Justin Jefferson or A.J. Brown have ever given us. That's how good, how productive Nico Collins was on a per route basis in these situations last year. And that to me is just like mind-blowing. I really expected his rate to be heavily influenced in the way that Ayuk's was, but it wasn't. Everything from an analytics standpoint suggests that Nico Collins is like the man. Like he's the receiver in this room that brings the upside to be a year-over-year like elite wide receiver for fantasy purposes. So when it comes to like parsing between these guys and deciding who to take for dynasty, it's like clearly Nico, in my opinion. I've got him up above Ayuk. I think he's a top 12 guy. Like I've been landing a ton of him in drafts.
So we talked about sample size earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really compelling case. I think it's easy to look at some of the things he did and say, well, he's not going to do that again. And right, like if you're looking at it from a per target basis, it was almost 12 yards per target. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Tyreek Hill several times, and Tyreek Hill has been amongst he and Tyler Lockett for most of their careers have been the 2 best yards in terms of yards per target, and it's been right around 10. Like it's about 20%. And some players have seasons like that where they do. He had an incredible combination in terms of an ADOT and still deeper ADOT and still having a ton of yak. He made a lot happen after the catch. And we don't see that year over year happen very often. Do you think that he just sees the increase in targets next year? Because it was a pretty low target total for a guy that produced like he did. And that completely covers up any regression in the efficiency. It's like an HN argument.
Yeah, I think Jamar Chase is the good comparison. So Jamar Chase is the only player on that list that I just mentioned that has a target per route run rate below 25%. Nico Collins was right at 25%. Jamar's was 22. Basically, everyone else was 27% or higher. And we saw with Jamar Chase that in the years following, his targets rose enough to offset some of the regression that just naturally had to come with all the huge plays that he busted.
Okay. How was Nico's production last year influenced by Tank Dell on the field or off the field?
So with Tank Dell off the field, Nico Collins had some just really, really silly rates. Like, it's, again, stuff that just suggests in an ideal situation where he was like a clear de facto wide receiver one, he would be someone who might break fantasy because, like you mentioned, he has the ability to get open down the field, draw targets at a high rate on those downfield routes, and then also create yards after the catch. And that puts you into the Julio Jones stratosphere of just creating yards at an absurd rate. With Tank off the field, he was targeted on 30% of his routes and averaged 3.3 yards per route run. That was a 258 route sample size, so not insignificant. Those per route run rates are like Tyreek Hill and no one else, basically. Like, that is crazy stuff. With Tank on the field, his target per route run rate fell to 23%, and his yard per route run rate was 2.88. 2.88 is still really, really strong. This is 210 routes. I think it's more important to recognize that his targets and his first downs per route run did drop a bit with Tank on the field. That yard per route run rate, if I had to guess, is a bit fluky on the high side, influenced by big plays a little bit. So yeah, with Tank, with Nico, I'm not projecting him to come anywhere near this top end of his range of outcomes. I just bring it up to like illustrate the point that it's possible that he could be that kind of a player at some point in his career.
I didn't ask you this, and so it'll be a bad job on me if you don't, but do you have Tank's numbers with Nico on the field there too, and they were sharing the field together?
No, I don't have that. I can look it up if you want. I can bring it up later.
And because Adam Azer talks a lot about the games that they play together. And it was relatively close in terms of production, but I think it's also like you do a better job of breaking it down to on a per route basis. This is what Nico did when Tank Dell was on the field also. And then we have to try to, in some way, figure out, well, how does Stefon Diggs at this stage of his career impact that? I would assume that Nico Collins and Tank Dell, whatever they did when they were on the field to get together last year in terms of targets per route run, we'll let the yards and the yak and all that stuff figure itself out. But in terms of targets per route run, in terms of target share, that's going to be at least a little bit lower with Diggs on the field than it was last year when they were on the field together, because the guy that was on the field with them last year was Noah Brown or Robert Woods or John Mechie.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely think so. I agree with that. I think that feels inevitable. So with Nico Collins off of the field, Tank Dell was targeted on 29% of his routes. That dropped to 21% with Nico on the field. His first down per route run rate was 12% with Nico off the field. That dropped to 10%. 10% is still really, really good.
Right. So it was about 30% for Nico and 29% for Tank when they were by themselves, and 23% for Nico and 21% for Tank when they were on the field together. And that's where I get lost is, well, one of them was in year one, one of them was in year three. Does year two and year four make up that difference? And that's the fun part of what we're going to find out this year. The main point is we are big Nico Collins and Tank Dell backers this year. We are not very excited about Stefon Diggs. I would be selling Diggs to anyone who thought that he was going to give you even a high-end wide receiver 2 season this year. And I'd be acknowledging that Stefon Diggs is probably one injury away from seeing his dynasty value go to almost zero.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at.
let's get to a team that we have maybe less information on, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on it all, because I've pretty much gone into Lad McConkey is the wide receiver one for the Chargers just almost immediately after he was drafted. He's my wide receiver 27 in Dynasty, right there with Xavier Worthy, who we're going to talk about next. But there are other guys on the team. Quentin Johnston is in year 2. He's my wide receiver 51. It's possible that this regime could just use Quentin Johnston like he should be used, and not like he's Mike Williams, because he's shown us last year he's not Mike Williams. And then I've got Josh Palmer at wide receiver 55. Probably if you were just going to place a bet on who gets 800 yards, Josh Palmer is the best bet, because I think kind of like Romeo Doubs, Josh Palmer is going to play. We'll figure out the rest of the guys. Do you have any thoughts on how this receiving core is going to work out? And am I too high or too low on one of these guys?
I prefer Palmer to QJ, even in Dynasty.
Yeah.
It's possible that I'm jumping the gun on giving up on Johnston. He was a developmental receiver who was asked to do something he wasn't ready to do. I feel like everybody kind of knew that going in. So I don't want to just give up on him, but if you look at his per route data and compare it to wide receivers that we've had as rookies, like it's bad. There's really like no example of a wide receiver being so unproductive with his routes and then going on to do much in their NFL career. Matt Harmon's work kind of showed the same thing. It was just really, really bad last year, about as bad as it can get. Josh Palmer, I'm actually intrigued by. We'll get to McConkey in a second, but I want to bring up Palmer here and talk about him for a second, because I don't feel like he's somebody that gets talked about hardly at all. So right. Palmer has a 239 route sample size in his career with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams off the field. That's not a huge sample size. It's not quite the 350 like full season's worth of data that we want, but it's not insignificant either. And he was targeted on 22% of his routes within that sample and averaged 1.9 yards per route run, 10% first down per route run rate. For reference, those rates would have sat just below DK Metcalf and just above Devontae Smith in 2023. It's basically identical to the per route data from everybody's favorite sleeper, Dontayvion Wicks. So I think there's honestly more juice here than people realize. Palmer's per route data was much, much better in year 3 than it had been in previous years. And I think he's clearly the guy who's most likely to get 100 yards, like you mentioned. And I wonder if he just outright is like the guy we should be projecting for the most production here. That sounds crazy. I know everyone loves Lad McConkey, but Lad McConkey is not someone who ever dominated targets or really came close. Like his per route data at the collegiate level is pretty concerning. He definitely had, some target competition. Brock Bowers is he was the offensive centerpiece for a reason. He's really, really good. But McConkey only had more than 7 targets in 2 games. He topped out at 9 targets for his career. He only had more than 6 targets in 4 games. I don't know that he's going to come in as a rookie and be an offensive centerpiece. That feels unlikely. He's somebody who struggled against press coverage and only drew targets on 24.6% of his routes at the collegiate level throughout his career. So projecting that type of data profile to come into the NFL and put up better target rates or even similar is really takes a leap of faith. I know that when you watch McConkey on film, he's just breaking off awesome routes and getting open all the time. So maybe this stuff doesn't matter. But at least when it comes to Palmer, I think it's worth noting that there really is upside for him to be the clear top target in this offense and the guy that's trusted. Whereas the other 2 guys are young and haven't proven that they can handle that type of a target share at the NFL level.
I do appreciate the reminder from Mr. Scampers that DJ Chark is in LA. Yeah, DJ Chark is there. He doesn't matter at all. So you're buying Josh Palmer at a wide receiver 45, wide receiver 50 cost, and thinking he could be a number 3 wide receiver. That's the other thing is when you talk about an offensive centerpiece or leading this team in targets, that might be 110 targets this year. Mm-hmm. It might be a 19-20% target share because they're splitting up 20% of the targets between a couple of tight ends in Hayden Hurst and Will Dissly. I think those are the guys who are on the team. And so I'm not necessarily expecting Ladd McConkey to come have like a Tank Dell type season, even what Tank Dell did when he was healthy, just because I don't think it takes that. But Palmer is definitely cheaper. I think you can get him easily for a late second in Dynasty and maybe even for a third.
Yeah, that's basically where I'm at. Is Palmer's like free? I mentioned we're doing a bunch of startups, and so he's somebody that we get pretty often, and it's just like no one wants him. More so, I'm worried about McConkey. He's not. I haven't landed him really anywhere. I prefer a lot of the rookies that go around him.
Let's do one more team here, and we got to talk about the Chiefs when Jacob is on. We still don't really know anything about Rashee Rice, except maybe not in quite as much trouble as we thought the last time that we talked. But I have these guys right now in Dynasty lined up as Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 26, Rashee Rice at wide receiver 31, Marquise Brown at wide receiver 42, Travis Kelce at tight end 8. You had some interesting data on Kelce when Rice was on the field last year. I think it really gets framed as the Chiefs just didn't use Travis Kelce as much in the second half of the season because they were saving him for the playoffs. And when I saw what you had posted, it kind of looked like, well, there might be a little bit more to the story.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that his target per run rate did drop from 28% with Rice off of the field to 21% with Rice on the field. I think it makes sense given the type of role that they each fill as short, intermediate area of the field workers for Kansas City. And so, like, depending on what the suspension looks like for Rice, we could see Kelce take on a larger role than he did last year. I think that's interesting. Really, Marquise Brown is the guy who I'm curious what you think about him. You had him at wide receiver 42 and Worthy 26. How do you project them for this year?
They are almost exactly the same. I was moved a little bit by Brown sitting at the Mavericks game with Mahomes and Kelce. Like, I think that's not quite having breakfast with or rooming with in the summer, but it's not nothing either. Especially I think they were in Rice's hometown. So yeah, I think the most likely outcome is that Marquise Brown is in Worthy's way early this season, and we find out if Worthy can take the job, because I have a hard time imagining a lot of snaps with both Brown and Rice both Brown and Worthy on the field.
Which of the two do you think is more likely to be like really pushing down the field into the like super high average route depth, average depth of target kind of role that we've seen guys like Justin Watson and Marquez Valdes-Scantling fill?
I could see either one of them doing that.
Right. Because I think they both.
Right. The difference is the other thing that those two guys did is block. And I don't know if I see either one of them blocking. So it kind of seems like they are two guys for one role.
Yes, that's kind of where I'm at with it, is like, I think they're more redundant than people realize. I think both receivers, people think of them as like pure downfield guys. And so they're like, oh, they'll just fill that role better than the guys that the Chiefs had last year. But really that hasn't been. I think they're both pretty good working the middle area of the field. And, Marquise Brown's average depth of target has topped out at 12.9. It's been somewhere between 11 and 12.9 in all 5 of his seasons. He's never been like anywhere near the MVS kind of stuff, even though his average route depth is typically right around 9, which is really, really high, 9 yards. Brown, I'm a little bit concerned. His yards per route run has dropped for 5 straight seasons, and part of that has to do with circumstance, of course. His target per route run rate, though, has been right around 22% every single year, as he really hasn't had significant target competition. He's just kind of had a role carved out for him. And I don't know what to expect from him in this offense. As I projected, I think that there's like real upside for Worthy to step into a large target role if he's really, really good. If he comes in and has like clearly more juice than Brown. We've seen Worthy actually, I don't know if people realize like how much of a target hog he was at Texas, but that is what he was. Like when he came in his first year, his target per run rate was elite. as a true freshman. And across his career, when he was on the field, his target rate was the second highest of all the incoming rookies. I think people think of him just because his 40 time was so high as like just this downfield guy, but like he's somebody who can win in a lot of different areas. And I think the Chiefs are really, really excited about him. And so like if he realizes that potential, like I just don't know what kind of role is really left for Brown.
Well, and I would be a little bit more concerned if Xavier Worthy was able to participate in OTAs, but he got a slight hamstring injury and has just been watching on the side.
Hate that.
And so I know it's a week and it's May, but I don't like that for a rookie learning Andy Reid's offense. So yeah, no, I think we're in the same place, is that we're both worried that only one of these guys is really going to be able to be on the field very often. We did have a comment that somebody said these two are going to be on the field together a lot, according to what Mahomes said recently. I got to be really careful with what he said. You should really instead watch who he's sitting by at basketball games. That's going to tell you the true story. Do you have any concern that Kelce is not going to be still elite, or do you think that is like whenever they decide they're going to go to Kelce, he's still going to be the same guy he's been?
Yeah, I don't have much concern, especially if Rice does start the season suspended. I think that Kelce's going to continue to be like the offensive centerpiece for as long as he's healthy. So like, I think last year the injury really affected him more than people realize. I think he was kind of playing through that. I think Kelce, I believe I've seen Dan Schneider take him at tight end 1 in a few drafts.
Yep.
And I think you can justify that for this year alone. I know this is a dynasty show.
Right.
But yeah, I think to me, I have him over Laporta. To me, the discussion is actually between him and Trey McBride for this year.
Well, and I think it does matter for dynasty though, if Travis Kelce's tight end 1 or if he's tight end 4 and further fading, because if I'm a true contender and Kelce starts off the season as tight end 1 through September and looks like his old self, then I'm probably okay with giving up that 2025 first and let's go win the league. But you don't really want to make that decision in May, because let's see how many games Rashee Rice is going to be there, and let's see what they look like on the field, and let's make sure it was the injury or resting Kelce and not just that he's starting to finally ride off into the sunset. Let's take one more break and then we'll talk about a few more on-off splits.
Football action continues. Are you ready for this? Ready to take chances? As the gridiron is taken over by the Great White North. It's time to storm the fortress. It's time to fight on the battlefield. Catch the Canadian Football League on CBS Sports Network.
So definitely a guy that I'm a little bit higher on than consensus in Dynasty is George Pickens. And his splits when Diontae Johnson was not on the field are a big part, I think, of the reason why, because Diontae Johnson now in Carolina looks like maybe Roman Wilson's the number 2 wide receiver. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the number 2 wide receiver. Pat Fryer is the number 2 wide receiver. Jalen Warren's the number 2 wide receiver. Let's talk about what George Pickens did when Diontae Johnson was not on the field.
Yeah, with Diontae Johnson off the field, George Pickens went nuts. And it was really encouraging because we had never seen him do that. We've seen him be really efficient. So like Ryan Heath brought him up as like one of the clearest examples of like a big play merchant, whereas first downs per route run indicate that his yard per route run rate is maybe a bit fraudulent. And that's kind of the player he's been, is like he can dominate down the field and make huge plays. Everybody knows that. Everybody sees that like clearly he's good. But he never had shown an ability to draw targets like a wide receiver 1. But with Diontae Johnson off the field last year, that's exactly what we saw. And we saw for an extended 2 or 3 game sample size where it's like wide receiver 1, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 1. Like, love to see it. 18% target per round rate for Pickens with Johnson on the field. That rose to 24% with Johnson off of the field. That's a really healthy target per route run rate. That puts him up into like, a true wide receiver 1 in an offense type of territory. And then of course his yards per run rate were insane. I don't want to give too much credence there because it is small sample size, but we saw his first read target rate skyrocket as well. And I just think it's exciting. I don't know what to expect from this offense, obviously, but I do think like we've seen Drake London. We've seen AJ Brown put up like insane per route data when the offense really, really concentrates on one wide receiver, because they are, like we talked about, doing a lot of 1 and 2 wide receiver sets, where it's like you mentioned, who is it going to be? Pat Freiermuth? Like, it's mostly going to be Pickens, just the offense running through the ground game and then running through play action targets to Pickens that I think will probably be pretty dang efficient.
That is George Pickens, my number 17 wide receiver in Dynasty. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get, like, what happens if the first 5 weeks of the season, those numbers you just gave, just for the targets, not even for the yards because they're outlandish. What if he has a 24% targets or per route run rate? Like, he's going to be a top 12 Dynasty wide receiver. I consensus, in my opinion. But he's got to do it first. Zay Flowers on off the field with Mark Andrews, not quite as encouraging.
Honestly, I this might be weird, but I was kind of encouraged by this. I thought that it would be a more drastic change. Just from the way I remembered it during the season, it felt like when Andrews went down, they implemented Flowers as like the clear first read guy, designed all these touches to him. But really, his rates didn't fall off that much. His target per route runner with Andrews on the field was 19%, down from 22% with him on the field. 19% we can work with if he's still making plays down the field. Overall, like, if we project him for just that and no like improvement in year 2, then he's probably going to disappoint people at his ADP. But he's still, like, if that's the baseline, like that's not bad, and that leaves room for upside. His yard per route run rate with Andrews on the field was 1.7. It was 1.75 with Andrews off. So really, like, kind of minimal change. So that's pretty exciting to me, because I would assume that he's only going to become a bigger and bigger part of the offense and, be more efficient with his opportunities.
Yeah, I think what the hope is that he can convince them that he's their number one wide receiver by the time that Mark Andrews is fading, and that it doesn't turn into a situation where Mark Andrews fades and then somebody else takes over Mark Andrews' role and Zay Flowers is still the number 2. I do think that there's a lot of room for growth for him. He is my number 15 wide receiver in Dynasty. Again, I'm pretty high on him. So I chose the guys that you were tweeting about that I'm also pretty high on, it seems like. But I want to get to another one here because you had several and I don't want to leave any out. And this one is the guy, not in Dynasty so much, but in redraft, where I find myself like 3.5 rounds ahead of everyone else on Courtland Sutton. And nobody wants to draft him. And I'm kind of okay with it. And you made me feel a little better about it.
Yeah, I've always been out on Sutton and been more of a Jeudy guy, because when they're both on the field, Jeudy has like completely dominated the targets, and Sutton has been more of an afterthought, like barely even usable for fantasy. But Judy's been on and off the field like persistently throughout his career, and so we have a pretty large sample size at this point of Sutton running routes with Jeudy off the field, and he's a like really relevant fantasy wide receiver within that split. And so here we are again, where there's like, it's just Sutton. Like, maybe Marvin Mims steps into a larger role, but it seems like he's probably going to be the clear-cut top first read on almost every play that the Broncos drop back to pass on. So the splits with Jeudy off of the field last year, 24% target per route rate, 2.2 yards per route run for Sutton. That is really strong stuff. It was only 100 routes though, but we do have a larger sample size over the past 2 seasons. It's basically the same, 24%, 2.19. And so for reference, just looking at last year's receivers, that's the same range as like Amari Cooper, DJ Moore, Cooper Kupp, even like Deebo Samuel, Stefon Diggs. Like, there's some good guys there that you're not going to be drafting Courtland Sutton around any of those guys. And
right.
part of that has to do with Denver's offense, of course, but that, to me, like, he's one of the clearest values for season-long leagues, and he's somebody who I'm fine taking in Dynasty, because unless Troy Franklin really, really surprises us, like, he's going to be the wide receiver 1 for at least the next year or 2, I would think.
I think the next year he's not happy with his contract now, and I'm not sure Sean Payton likes him. So I think that's the risk, is that they find somebody else that will trade for Courtland Sutton, and that they already have a number 1 wide receiver that's a lot better than him. I want you to, if you have a second, to just kind of compare your feelings on Mims and Franklin. Mims is a year older. We've already seen him not really do anything in the NFL, which is a mark against him. But the same regime drafted both and spent more draft capital on Mims than they did Franklin. And I liked Mims a little more as a prospect coming out than I did Franklin. I have them back to back at wide receiver 44 and 45. How do you view Mims and Franklin?
I prefer Franklin because, like you said, we haven't seen him fail at the NFL level yet. and also he's got the great fit with his college quarterback. Both of them had really, really strong per route data at the collegiate level. You have to be a little bit more careful with collegiate per route data. It doesn't always translate because there's a lot of stuff that goes into that circumstantially. But I wanted to bring Mims' per route data up because I'd kind of given up on him after his rookie season. To me, he just looked like he was somebody I was excited for, but he looked like, okay, this is only going to be a deep threat who's not going to be very relevant for fantasy. His target rates were just really, really low. And we see a lot of guys come in and fill that kind of a role. And then it's unless you're like truly, truly elite at it, it's really hard for those players to matter in fantasy filling that role. But tiny grain of salt here. Maybe we have some hope. It was only 69 routes with Jeudy off the field, but his target per route run rate was 20% on those routes, up from 11% with Jeudy on the field. So if you're not a Troy Franklin believer, then I think you could, maybe pick up Mims late in some drafts, maybe trade for him, whatever you got to do there. I think it might make sense. But honestly, I just think that it's possible too that Sean Payton rotates receivers so much that neither Mims or Franklin are going to matter for fantasy.
There's the really optimistic view.
Sorry.
Let's just continue that trend because we need to talk about Evan Engram with Christian Kirk on the field, with Christian Kirk off the field. It's hard to look at what Engram did last year and not think he's a top 5 tight end this year, but he's probably not a top 5 tight end this year.
Yeah, there's two tight ends here that people are pretty sold on because they had big years last year, but I'm a little bit worried about. Ingram's target per route run rate dropped from 27% with Kirk off of the field to 21% with Kirk on the field. And 21% we can still get by with, but I don't think that you should be drafting him just expecting to see what we've seen the past couple of years here, because there have been a lot of things that have really helped inflate his numbers. Christian Kirk has been really good these last 2 years. Everybody doubted him, and then he came in and really crushed in his first year in Jacksonville and was even better last year on a per route basis. He improved across the board. Targets, first downs, yards per route run, all were better. He just struggled with health. But when I watched Jacksonville, it was like palpable that like Kirk was the only thing that was really working in the offense. Engram, it felt like they were just kind of going there because they had to. And I don't think they're going to have to as much with Kirk back.
And then you said there were 2 tight ends. Just go right to David Njoku, because this is one of the best points. And I'll preface this by saying I've talked about this in the Kevin Stefanski on offense, and we've heard a lot of talk about it with Alex Van Pelt going to New England. Like Stefanski's run a very tight end centric offense. There's been times where there's been 2 guys that have split it too much, and so it's not been as obvious. But he's always been in the upper third, really probably the upper quadrant in terms of tight end target percentage at 24, 25% or higher. What did we see with Njoku, though, specifically with Deshaun Watson?
Yeah, Njoku's splits here are even more concerning. He was like wholly reliant on that time where he got to run routes for Joe Flacco. And I think it makes sense stylistically, just given the way that Watson has played quarterback. He is like really, really targeting downfield guys, and not so much with Njoku on the shorter stuff. So Njoku scored 79% of his PPR points without Deshaun Watson on the field last year. His target per route run rate dropped from 27% without Watson to 17% with Watson on the field. We saw Amari Cooper, on the other hand, like really, really be the clear focal point of the offense with Watson on the field, and that's just because he loves pushing the ball down the field to him. And so that does concern me about Njoku going forward. He's somebody who I'm not getting in any drafts.
And what concerns me is how many games is Deshaun Watson going to play this year? So but they don't have Joe Flacco to take over, so it probably still doesn't matter for Njoku.
I was going to say, I think Jameis Winston is probably a lot closer to Watson than Flacco stylistically, like the way he likes to play.
Right. That was awesome stuff. As always, Jacob Gibbs. I really appreciate the information, the data. Go follow him on Twitter at JAGibbs_23. The whole idea for this show came from one of his Twitter threads. I basically just hit retweet. You need to be following this guy so you can get good information, so you can go get these guys before they break out or before they bust in the case of a couple of those tight ends. Programming note, I will be traveling on Friday. There will not be a Friday edition of FFT Dynasty, but we will talk to you next Tuesday.